First of all, welcome everyone to DaRE Invites. I'm Simon Ellis, and together with Kate Marsh, my colleagues Kate Marsh and Lily Hayward-Smith, we organize and run this series of events or series of conversations, really. And this is the third of three so far in a series called The Body and Science. And we're thinking there might be a couple more, but we're not sure yet. It's looking like they'll be in the beginning in the autumn, actually, the northern autumn, depending on where you are. I'm imagining most of you are in the northern hemisphere here. And I was recently reading a book by Diane Hamilton and colleagues called Compassionate Conversations. This is by way of introduction to this series, that is not today's talk. And Hamilton wrote, "We want to talk about the objective world, but include our subjective lived experience, our feelings and emotions." And there's something about that very simple idea that struck me as being somewhat aligned with this curiosity about how we engage or how we are in conversation with people who work in or comment on science. And so today it's I'll tell the story just briefly, but today it's just a great pleasure to welcome Heather Hauser. Heather, I'm going to read her biography right now, writes about science, the environment, and contemporary culture. She's danced on and off since she was 4 years old, and I love this, as a proud amateur. The books are Infowhelm, Environmental Art and Literature in an Age of Data, and Ecosickness in Contemporary U.S. Fiction, Environment and Affect. She's the Mody C. Boatright Regents Professor in American and English Literature at the University of Texas at Austin. And she's now currently the 2023-24 Mellon New Directions Fellow in Baltimore, Maryland, right? I'll just say briefly, Heather and I have just met. A few years ago, I read actually a book, which included a chapter by Heather, and the book was called Time, a Vocabulary of the Present. And Heather's chapter was called Human/Planetary. And I was really struck by Heather's thinking about the human, the planet, our relationship in time between these two things. And so it was just on a whim, really, that I emailed Heather and said, would you be interested in talking to us? And Heather, it turns out, as you've just heard, has an interest in dance and has danced for a long time, and pitched something back at me which was quite different from what I was initially imagining. So I think that's probably enough just to say that Heather's going to, how it's going to work today anyway, is that Heather's going to present and talk for about 20 minutes or a little less than 20 minutes. She and I will be in a conversation which will be about that long or less. We'll take a little time for a break and then open up for questions. So I think I've covered everything. And Heather, just a pleasure. It's such a pleasure to welcome you to DaRE Invites.
Yeah, thank you so much, Simon, for inviting me initially on your whim, and then for being in conversation by email. And thank you to Lily for handling all these logistics along the way. It was such a delight to get the invitation, and that Simon was willing to go on a journey with me to find something that would be hopefully relevant and of interest to DaRE, but also, open up some reflections from my perspective as an amateur dancer. And if anyone's interested, I just put in the chat a link to a copy of the remarks I'm going to give in case you want to read along or track down any of the references that I throw out here. So we'll get started. We are all amateur bodies, and I mean this in a trivial sense, in the sense that no one can be professional or expert in all that the body can do. But I also mean it in a more precise sense that's tied to the etymology, the roots of the word amateur. So Robert Stebbins, who's a sociologist of leisure, he and others who work on amateurism remind us that that word from Latin amare or amateur is one who loves. We are all lovers or amateurs through our bodies. The body brings love, and sometimes that love is paltry, hard-won, fleeting. But I'd wager, I think that through sport or dance, movement of any kind, but also touch, sensation, eating, sex, everybody is amateur in this sense of love. And I think this could sound Pollyanna naive, but I wanted to begin with this etymological reminder and a real sense of commonality. Because the term amateur is usually used to separate groups rather than establish likenesses. The amateur is not professional, not expert, not authorized. And these divisions are necessary and very serious in things like law or medicine or engineering or aeronautics. And they can be more casual in something like gardening or yoga or model airplane building. But that air of exclusion or separation from the sanctioned, I think, permeates the idea of the amateur. And I mean, one of the reasons I was excited by this invitation is that, among many, was I had just been reading an essay by novelist Diana Evans, and this idea of divisiveness really comes out of her reflections on being a dancer. So she hesitates to own that term, and she writes, quote, "When I tell people that I used to be a dancer, it seems only half a truth. I was never officially trained. I went to no Laban, Conservatoire, or Rambert. I sidestepped into it and rode its fairground waltzer for 2 or 3 years, and then I went and got a desk job," end quote. So the sidestepper, the rider, the interloper, to be a dancer, who gets to own the phrase, even with her past tense qualifier, used to be? Are you a dancer? The older women sitting next to me at Vail Dance Festival asked me a couple summers ago. And it's not the first time this has happened. I get asked it often at dance performances in the audience, not on stage. And maybe because of my posture, or maybe because I have this, I think, probably an air of reverence or anticipation for the performance to come. And in response, I have something like Evan's hesitation. So I was officially trained, though nowhere very illustrious, certainly not conservatory or the Lambert School. But the years of hours in the studio, some on stage, amateur stages, do they make me a dancer? So I usually say, like, yeah, sort of, but I don't dance professionally. Like, I'm always very strict and clear about that. Numerous documentaries, memoirs, and biographies by professionals capture what it means to be a dancer. So here's Agnes DeMille on the quiddity of the dancer. Quote, "The hardest part may very well be mental or emotional, but dancers live in their muscles. You must never forget this." From a different tradition, Annie B. Parson characterizes, quote, "The things that dance," and I'd say by extension, the dancer, "the things that dance owns ambiguity, layer, abstraction, the non-narrative." And many others will offer definitions and characterizations of the dancer. When I answer yes, sort of, to that question, I mean that I've been trained in tap, jazz, modern, little hip hop, but mostly ballet since the age of 4. And I also mean that time in studios has punctuated my life ever since. So 4, 14, 24, 34, now 44. I still take classes. I mean that I've learned vocabulary primarily in classical ballet, behind which there's a history about which I don't know a great deal, but I know it's there and I know some of it. And I know that there's also sociocultural history surrounding it. And I mean that there's a connection between this vocabulary, an internalized ideal of its manifestation, and the actual physical manifestation by me or another dancer at a given moment. So when I say I'm a dancer, I mean that this physical manifestation is for me, as for all dancers, influenced by vagaries that make no one manifestation like another. Vagaries like pain, enthusiasm, mood, weather, tiredness, music, lighting, space, the other bodies in the room, the other movements in the sentence with that movement. So dance, perhaps especially classical forms, is all theme and variation, standard and deviation. Even the step executed most classically is variation and deviation. So these are some of my truths when I cop to being a dancer, sort of. While being not professional can suggest lack, amateur status does have substance. The amateur body in dance harbors all that I've just listed, those dispositions and forms of knowledge or know-how. It also harbors, for me, the freedom of return. So I most feel my amateur body in dance when I come back to the studio as a choice. The professional must return after a pause due to injury or pregnancy or holiday or some other hiatus, because if they don't, they won't be professional. They'll be ex-professional or post-professional. I can stop without relinquishing my already attenuated status as amateur. Numerous pauses have interrupted and defined my career as an amateur dancer. So mostly, and especially when I was younger, I paused because I couldn't afford it, or because I've moved to a new city and have had to find a teacher, and I'm picky or snobbish enough that no one will do for a while. But I always feel the itch and return again. And each return feels like a beginning, which is something other people writing about amateurism have noted. In this feeling, Kim Adonisio's poem, Wishbone, resonates for me. She writes, quote, "A cat has several lives, and so do you. Look, a bird at the window has eaten your youth, but what luck, all these years later, and you're still a beginner." Each return makes the aging body palpable. The older I get, the more I feel the impact of ever shorter pauses, even like 1 week. The bird of passing days has eaten my youth, but I can begin again. I return as a beginner to this body, the body at maybe 41, the last time I returned after a pause, rather than the body at 11 or 21 or 31, in which the distance between the ideal and the manifestation has definitely widened. But I return with the amateur's passion, training, and encoded memory. And so one of the things I was interested in reading Evan's essay and sort of reflecting on this is this status of being both deeply drawn to and being an outsider to dance. This duality crops up in her essay in declaring herself a used-to-be dancer, and then also in my sort of. So attraction drives us to return, while being an outsider permits us to pause. In her essay, Evans identifies what famous dancers like Alvin Ailey and Nijinsky record in their biographies. Quote, and this is Evans, "The theme of mental malaise, an unraveling in periods of dormancy or after dance, the dangerous misery of motionlessness. We, were fallen beings into the madness of ordinary life." So the after dance isn't just a lack of dancing, it's a state all its own. And you either have to correct it or you make your peace with it. And many of us do the former, we return. So illustrator Leanne Shapton captures this beautifully in her memoir, Swimming Studies. So Shapton's a writer and an illustrator, but she had a career as a swimmer when she was younger and was headed toward the Olympics, and around the age of 14 realized what many of us do. This is the end of that career, at least the professional track. So Shapton comes close, but she misses the rankings to go to the Olympics that year. But later she too returns. Quote, "I'm drawn to swimming pools, all swimming pools, no matter how small or murky. When I swim now," and she's in, I think, her late 40s or late 30s, 40s, "I step into the water as though absent-mindedly touching a scar." So the past lives in her body as a healed wound. It entitles her to be engulfed again. But her labor in the pool is now not labor toward, but a constant becoming without a specific goal. And I think the embodied epistemology of the amateur is this constant becoming, an epistemology of process without a specific goal. Kimmerer Lamotte, I'm not sure if I'm saying her name right, you guys can correct me. She writes of being, quote, "the movement that is making me." So all dancers inhabit this state, but the amateur, I think, is especially accorded the privilege of this epistemology of becoming and process. And here I'm going to pivot to the other theme of this series. I think there's something deeply scientific in this epistemology as well. The dancer experiments on themselves repeatedly. So even in my dance classes where I don't expect to accomplish much except loving it, I'm going through those calculations of, if I move my torso 3 degrees this way, will my attitude be different? Can I hold it longer? Will it feel easier? And I love the experiment, the kind of experimental reckoning of, like, you know that you've hit a turn just maybe the last time, and are trying to replicate the conditions, right? Like, how deep was my plie? What was my spot like? Or even what socks was I wearing? The socks, I wear socks now, not shoes usually. The socks are very important. So the dancer cannot evolve without self-experimentation. For the amateur whose labor is constant becoming, we might say self-experimentation is both process and goal. And so in this respect, the amateur body in dance resembles the amateur body that's propelled the history of science. Self-experimentation has advanced practices of immunization, anesthesia, I knew I'd stumble on this, catheterization, understanding poisons and their antidotes, and the infectiousness or lack thereof of cancer. So all of these things are things scientists have used themselves as mediums for knowledge in. And this self-experimentation is, of course, greatly controversial. And what's more, I think for me, someone studying science, the history of medicine, unauthorized forms of experimentation cannot but invoke the history of medical violence against Black people and women of color. So the ethically dubious practice of self-experimentation stands alongside the forms of experimentation without consent that mar medical history, and that history is not really past. From the gynecological abuses of enslaved women by J. Marion Sims, to the syphilis studies at Tuskegee that left Black men to die of the disease, to non-consensual clinical trials of birth control on Puerto Rican women. The amateur body threads through science in other ways, from pilfering corpses, often of poor criminal and/or Black people from graveyards, to creating forms of life that defy ethics, with the so-called monster in Shelley's Frankenstein, or the first gene-edited babies by Hu Jun-Kui. We might also think of forms of community science that recruit amateurs to go out into the field to capture data on everything from bird and bug populations to pollutants. So obviously the self-experimentation of the amateur dancer is not the same as that of the virologist. Me asking about my pirouettes is not the same as, infecting myself with a virus and to see how I might treat it. And I don't want to stretch the analogy too far, but I introduced this idea of self-experimentation to temper my impulse to oppose the body in dance and the body in science. And so I think that impulse is well-founded in most respects, and for good ethical reasons. The body in science has been professionalized through credentialing, risk and insurance, institutional review boards, and many other mechanisms. The body and relations to it face rigid control. These controls complement science's idealized relation to the body. So we can follow Ian Hacking in describing that idealized body of science as a, quote, neo-Cartesian body in parts. And what he means by this is that there's a return of a Cartesian idea of the body as alienated, mechanized, that's broken down into either very small, like genes, genetic material, or very large, like organs, into these parts that are then manipulable for specific ends. In addition to being partitioned, this body is also available for quantification. Unless it can be quantified, measured, and compared to a standard, a body stands outside science. It even defies it. So autoimmune diseases, contested and unclassified disorders like multiple chemical sensitivity, conditions even like long COVID are testaments to the defiant body in science. Deviations from the standard certainly ignite curiosity and spur investigation, but the deviant, defiant body can't constitute knowledge for science until it's wrangled back toward the norm, or at least approached in that way. And these are all gross generalizations. So science study shows all the ways that quantification, standardization, and ideal norms are just that, they're ideals, and things in practice are far messier. The body leaks beyond science's containers for it. And so I'm not advocating for medical science to eschew ethics and run to self-experimentation or rogue amateurism, but I am interested in the ways that the amateur body in dance might ignite an amateur spirit in science, or how we can think together about that. The body constitutes the métier for both the dancer and the medical scientist, its vehicle and vector, but the dancer must relate to the body in its parts, from finger, neck, spine, and as a whole, as a form, as a step, as choreography, as art. The body is instrument, but can't entirely be instrumentalized. So as I've been exploring, that body is a site of self-experimentation as both process and goal. And without ignoring all the problems and violences in controversial and non-consensual forms of self-experimentation, I wanted to think through, and would be happy to think further about how does and can that amateur spirit inform the body in science as well. So that's the end of my remarks, and happy to talk to Simon about this and any other things we might venture into.
Heather, thanks so much. I feel very nourished in many different ways, and thought maybe just as just to get us going, you talked about, just getting my notes here. You mentioned the body in dance and the body in science, and effectively not wanting to place them in opposition. And I just wondered that, these kinds of two hats that you've introduced us to, effectively your background as an amateur in dance, but also quite clearly your profession as someone who's thinking through with and through language and academia. And I wonder how these different expertises play, and clearly these different expertises, I should say, play differently in your identity. And how do you relate to your body when you were doing academia? And how do you relate to it when you were doing dance, when you were dancing? Are these distinct or different kinds of relationships?
Yeah. Well, here's a silly thing about the posture. I was a co-founder of a big interdisciplinary climate research program. And when I stepped down from it 4 years later, one of my colleagues is like, well, now who's going to make us feel bad about our posture and want to sit up straighter? Now, mind you, I've never said anything about anyone's posture ever, especially in a professional context. But so that's one way the two must meet. But I think I mean, we were friends. It was said in, like, if we weren't friends, that comment might have landed differently. But I think the self-consciousness like cuts across both. Like, even though, especially in a public context, sitting, or actually stand as I am now, working and writing most often and teaching most often. But especially in a public context, it's I don't feel myself as a mind by any means, like in the sense of a sort of a separation from the body. I feel very aware still of how I'm moving in space, and not necessarily in a performative way, like I want it to look a certain way. but it's hard not to, especially in, as I said, a public space, not to feel some of those things I mentioned in my remarks, like the vagaries of sound, light, the room, the atmosphere, the other bodies in the room. And I think that that carries over. I'm quite sensitive and to all of those aspects of like being a body in space and moving through space, even in a more professional context. And I'm sure non-dancers feel this as well, but I think for me, it definitely comes from that background. But also, like, I'm quite aware of, even though those two things merge, I definitely feel the dichotomies of, what, or think about the dichotomies of, what if I had become a dancer where my days were filled with, being in my body in that sense, versus now where there can be a separation. You know, yeah, a professional life of movement is not something, I've had. But I do think about what the effect that would have had.
You just end up spending all our time thinking about what socks we're going to wear anyway with that professional life of movement. It's interesting you say, though. I was just thinking, I was having a conversation with some of some of the postgraduates, some of the PhD students I'm working with, and they were talking about, these are people who are steeped in practice. They're people who have spent most of their lives deep in studios, let's say in their bodies. The prepositions are always a little bit odd when we talk about those kinds of things, but they were just talking about the feeling of cognitive work and how foreign it was. And they were, it was really clearly the I'll say the separation was weighing. I'll say it was weighing on their minds, whatever their minds are and wherever their minds are and however much they weigh.
Yeah. Yeah, no, so when I was a grad student, I do not have an academic family background at all, but one of my close friends, her mom was a professor and had written books and things. And remember her mother telling her, and then she telling us that intellectual work is also tiring. And I was like, I was at that point, what, 28 or 29, and I'd always thought, no, 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 the things that are tiring are being in a studio for 8 hours, or my dad was a construction worker, like, standing on roofs and moving, big stones all day. But it was a useful reminder to me, because I think in grad school, when you're an academic, it's, especially back then, I think there's much more awareness, if not total accommodation or privileging of how we're body minds. But even 15 years ago, when I was a grad student, the body wasn't a part of the conversation very much, right? And so I don't know, that was just really striking to me, to remember that, like, thinking is also effort in a more physical sense than I'd ever really given it credence to.
It's certainly not a disembodied activity.
Right. Yeah.
I was really struck by your use of the word authorized. I was just trying to you said it quite early on, and I can't quite remember. Yeah, who's was something about. Can you remind me? Oh yeah.
Yeah, that
Sorry.
often the amateur is sort of defined as a lack or a separation from the authorized, the expert.
Thank
The
you. Thank
professional.
you. Yeah. So it really sort of it really kicked me, that word, and it seemed that, and perhaps this is an obvious thing to say, that the idea of being an amateur seems quite distinct from the quality or even the expertise of someone. And I was reminded years ago now, having a conversation with a friend who was a medical a doctor, and was very comfortable, uh, uh, let's say, giving me advice about choreographic thinking. And it really struck me at the time that I would never I would never imagine giving a heart surgeon advice. For example, there's something about the kind of everydayness of, and I'm not quite sure what my point is here, other than to say there's something about the everydayness of dancing, that our relationship to dancing means such. And I guess I'm sort of saying that I loved that about this friend. That there was something really kind of comforting about the openness of this kind of language of the body in motion. Again, wonder if there's anything there you'd like to think through or respond to.
Yeah, I do think, dance is, of course, not everyone relates to it or sees themselves as a dancer. And of course, there can be reasons one cannot dance, at least in a more like conventional sense of it. But I do love that most people have a sense of what it means to dance, right? And that's where, but it is, I think what interested me in thinking about the amateur dancer myself, but also more broadly, is it is something that people would be hesitant to own, even if it is so familiar. I mean, your friend is maybe is an exception, but most people I encounter are kind of quick to say, sort of put them on the side of the good or the bad dancer, or the not like or
Yeah,
the
I
not
can't
dancer.
dance, or
Yeah, exactly. I
yeah,
mean, especially like dating or something, people hear you're a dancer and they think you're gonna make them run out and go like salsa tomorrow or something. And it's like, oh, it's
I'm
okay.
having
Like
I'm
not
having
everyone.
flashbacks.
Yeah, it's like, all right. But yeah, I think there's the availability and the accessibility of it, but also sort of a hesitation to own it, even by someone like me or Diana Evans writing about it, who's, been practicing in their own sense for a long time. And yeah, you're sorry if this is all too many anecdotes. You can tell me like to stop. But when I was in undergrad, there was a senior seminar. I went to a small liberal arts college, where you just got together and read books with several professors from different disciplines. And then, undergrads from different disciplines. There was a neuroscientist in there, and we were reading Judith Butler, and he was very angry about how inaccessible it was. And me, 20-year-old senior, college student, was like, why should it be accessible? I don't open the Journal of Neuroscience or the journal Neuron and expect to read that with facility, right? Like, I know I'm going to have to look up words that we didn't have Wikipedia back then, but now you go to Wikipedia. So I think some of that came for him from like, this is supposed to be a cultural scholar and culture is there for me to access, but this is so, obfuscatory, I guess. And so I think that, yeah, but your anecdote about like, you wouldn't go tell I wouldn't go tell the neuroscientist how to write or think, but he was very quick to be like, oh, this person is just doing this like to piss me off. Like, not that there's like a reason, there's a vocabulary, there's a conversation that it might be a part of.
Mm. Yeah, it's a really tricky one, that one, and perhaps it's not. I'm partly because of where I sit in relation to text that obfuscates and whether it
No,
needs
I
to do
feel
that. And
differently now. Yeah, too. I
yeah,
do feel
yeah, and I don't think that's just a problem in kind of cultural
yeah.
studies. I think it in fact, yeah, I think the language of statistics are incredibly complex if you're not used to those that kind of weight of numbers. But I'll come back to that a little bit, I think, later. I I was thinking about, this again, there's something about authorization and kind of processes of certification and authority. And it did make me think, and I don't want to, this is just a kind of thinking through something, really. I'm thinking through something, which is, I probably would say, and I've got colleagues here who probably would know far better than I do, that ballet, of all the dance forms, is probably steeped in processes of certification and authority far more than other kinds of dancing. That is, one could just, as long as one shows up and shows off, that is, this is what I can do, what it is your background is, or what it is that you've been trained in, is kind of irrelevant in a very different way from, you know, this apocryphal heart surgeon. And so, yeah, there's something there about the kinds of the differences across different kinds of trainings and the expectations of different kinds of dance forms. Yeah.
Yeah, and I admit the thing I've continued doing is ballet, and I've definitely done other forms of like modern contemporary dance along the way. But the thing I return to on that idea of return is ballet. So it is the thing I know best, and the thing I
Sure.
hesitate to speak for, what it's like to have an arc, a narrative in dance that runs on a different track but I do think that, yeah, certainly the yeah, the author, I was even looking at a website recently for a dance studio, and they were very clear about who should think they should attend an advanced level class, right? And I mean, you might find that for other dance forms, but it was very specific about, say, a number of years of trainings, the kinds of things you should be comfortable doing. And it used the vocabulary, like, can you do this step, for example? So I don't know, maybe you would find that on a website for a school for other forms of dance, but it struck me, it struck me that I knew exactly what, not just the words, but I'm like, I know what they're trying to communicate here. I know who they're trying to exclude here, right? They want someone entering an advanced class to know they'll be surrounded by people they're kind of
Yeah.
comfortable with.
No, I suspect that it's probably more like swimming lanes, you know, that there's the slow lane and the medium lane and the fast lane, and who it is that decides, and you realize that I'm in the medium lane and I'm going faster than you know, and there's that, and I know in this country, it gets a little bit, I'll just say passive aggressive, but occasionally active aggressive, in terms of which lane you're in, and so I think it's much more a kind of slightly a sorting hat kind of thing, because it's a curious thing about, you know, what it is that you can do, or the vocabulary, which is, you know, it touches on this thing of insider outsider, and how it is that we include and how it is that we exclude. And so, and also it's economical, in the sense that it's quite a useful thing to be able to go, if you have this sense, then this is the right class for you.
Yeah. No, I'm
Yeah.
I'm a super amateur swimmer in the sense that I learned how to swim like for real, do laps only a few years ago, and I do it really sporadically, and I'm terrified to go swim in places where there's like you have to share lanes, or there's that partitioning of ability. I'm like, no, I just want to be off in the corner and do my own thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
There's the
so
double
yeah,
pirouette lane there.
yeah, exactly. So yes, I mean, I think, and that goes to the point of like my opening point, that I think we're all amateur in our bodies because no one could do everything, right, with the same level of skill. But I hope we all find ways to love through, feel love through the body, whatever that might mean. And love is a very complicated, messy emotion on its own. But
Mm.
yeah. And I think it's a good reminder, right? When you feel expert in a certain thing, to try something very new and remember what it's like to start
Mm.
fresh.
Can you talk? Can you know, the poem was really beautiful, and it made me think about the kind of the luck of the beginner, or beginner's mind as well. And can you talk about because it seems like the sort of shift, because of clearly amateur is not the same as beginner. And can you talk about your shift across those two, that different languaging, for want of a better word?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the swimming is a good example. Like, I mean, I very much was a beginner as an adult. I mean, I had not a super beginner. I shouldn't say that, because I'd been in pools. I was comfortable putting my head underwater. It's good to even remember, like, you know, there's so many levels even of beginning. And I find that, like, speaking of dance websites, like, I notice studios will now say like absolute beginner ballet, right? Like, because I think what would happen is there would be a beginner ballet and someone would go and they're like, wait, that person knows what a dégagé is. Wait, that's not fair. This isn't actually a beginner class. So, I mean, even those gradations are interesting, that even if you might very much think of yourself as a beginner, to remember there might be a step before it that you've already taken. So these great, I mentioned that book by Stebbins, or I mentioned Stebbins, a sociologist of leisure, and he's written a lot about amateurism and is good, as a sociologist often is, on some of these like taxonomies of like, well, what's a hobbyist? What's a volunteer? What's an amateur? What's actual leisure? Like he has, and I think others, like serious leisure, right? So absolute leisure is maybe just taking a nap on your couch, which is not what being, you know, a swimmer is, or a rock climber. So I think those gradations are really important. But to go back to, yeah, I think the amateur already has passed certain thresholds of comfort or knowledge, having, you know, the encoded memory in their bodies or whatever activity they do. But I do think the beginning, or at least for me, sort of stopping and coming back is always, it's always very, especially longer pauses, sort of, you know, you're not beginning, right? You know, you're bringing, I mean, in my case, decades of knowledge, experience, and yet it sort of has to reactivate. You know, the beginning is often like not only the reactivating, but realizing you are different now than you were 3 years ago. And so that part, I mean, the body is always beginning in that sense. And that part to me is where like the beginner and the amateur also come together, after the pause, you know, beginning in the sense of experiencing what this body is, which happens day to day, but it's just a bigger adjustment after those longer pauses. It's often painful, a little sad. But there's so much knowledge in that. I mean, that's where that epistemology of process and becoming is relevant to me too. Like, the kinds of knowledge you get of feeling those differences is unique to, I think, the development from maybe like, oh, I'm a beginner dancer at age 4, and then I go up till I'm 14 and I'm, you know, that kind of development or arc is very different from the arc of like, okay, I've stopped and now my body is this, and what does it bring? That might be different from what it brought before.
Yeah, I think in a way you're sort of touching on a kind of like a difference Lyman thing, you know, the capacity to notice difference, and that when you take the breaks you're describing, as if you like not having seen a friend for 5 years, you notice their age, you notice the changes in their age that you wouldn't be staying with them. Something you described, you talked about and kind of sort of getting more into the science, I'll call it the sciencey part of what you discussed. And there's something about this, you know, the way in which the body that can be measured, the body that can be divided, compartmentalized into things that are very small and things that, as you described, that are much bigger at the level of the organ or the limb. And it reminds me, so I'm going to try, and maybe it's a bit of a long draw or a bit of a tenuous thread, which is one of the things I think, and my colleagues here at Center for Dance Research and we talk a lot, and a lot of our research in different ways touches on kind of an old question, really, which is about how to articulate things that are more or less ineffable, that are more or less very difficult or impossible maybe to be articulated, that there are, I guess this maybe touches on things like qualia. But I wonder how much I'd like you to respond to that, or just maybe you've got some thoughts about that, but also in relation to more in your kind of field of expertise in terms of the way in which information is communicated, and particularly large volumes of data and how those things are communicated. And so maybe there's something there for you to piece together.
Yeah. Well, I think I do. So this is the first time I've written about, well, first time I've publicly talked about dance, and I've just started writing about my own dance experience. And it's one of the things I'm noticing. I mean, this is writing, which is even another step away from what you were just describing. But it's hard to capture, yeah, that distance, right? Like I'm sorry, this is coming out, it's not articulate at all, but like if I want to write or articulate in any way about initiating a movement, right? One of the things I love about the teachers I love is the way that they can do that through metaphor, because like breaking it down in parts, it's asymptotic, right? It's like you're never going to quite get to whatever it is. So that's where metaphor comes in. And like, so you could break down a movement maybe very scientifically, right? Well, even at the level of a nerve or cell or something, like speaking of the neuroscientists, right? Like a neuron. And yet what would that get you? Would get you a lot if you're doing a certain kind of research, maybe. But what I love are the people who can activate movement mentally, physically through metaphor. And so that's one response to your question. I find the teachers I return to are those who have like a repertoire of metaphor as much as a repertoire of movement, that like respects that we're adult dancers and not like baby ballerinas. Like, what the adult dancer wants to do is not the same as what a 12-year-old or a 5-year-old wants to do. Anyway, but can you repeat the information part?
Well, it was thinking about the way in which, let's say kind of infographics, or the way in which information is designed, and in particular in relation to large volumes of data, which are, you might even say differently ineffable. That is, if you're talking about billions and billions, it's very difficult for us to imagine those kinds of scales. So there's a kind of process of filtering or narrowing the scale so that we can reach it, put it that way. And so, yeah, so I was just trying, I say, I'm not sure how strong the thread is between those two, but I was trying to draw some kind of connection between that and this asymptotic thing you described in terms of the way in which language approaches but never quite reaches the thing we're describing.
Yes, I think, so having worked on sort of the not only infographics or data visualizations, but some of the rhetoric around it from sort of the boosters. And this rhetoric, I studied it a while ago. I think there's more awareness of the limitations of data visualization than there used to be, although I think maybe we're hearing similar like boosterism around things like AI. Understandably, it's, does a lot of things, but there was a lot of confidence in that rhetoric of, say, like the early 2000s, 2010s, that an infographic, a visualization can spark insight. So this was the goal. And that's that kind of ineffable thing, but it's this kind of spark. And you just have to get it right. And like everyone will understand what the complex data, the big data set that you're trying to communicate in, preferably a bite-sized, can be, easily consumable too long didn't read form is like that there's sort of a formula for it that you could spark insight by specific tools, and you just have to find the right thing. And I think that that desire and the maybe confidence or hope that you could do that is really actually pointing to the fact that there is so much that you can't possibly distill down out of all of that data. Like there's always going to be that gap between the mass of information and what anyone can take up from it, much less like in a shortened or snippet form. But really, yeah, sort of confidence that there's something you can get at the maybe ineffable parts of data, which are supposed to be concrete in a sense, like, but also inaccessible at the same time. And now, I mean, I don't know that there's as much boosterism or like, gee whiz.
Can you explain what boosterism is? That's not a term I'm familiar with at all. Yeah.
Oh, just like these really strong advocates, like a lot of PR.
Okay. Oh,
yeah.
literally. Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah, literally. Yeah, I mean, it was an industry, basically. It was a whole industry that sprung up around data visualization, and like data science, of course, was also data analytics. I mean, these things are huge, and maybe AI is, disrupting all of that, I imagine. But and so yeah, just it was like this industry, and visualization was like a segment of it that was really taking off with a lot of confidence. Like, well, we don't need all these words, right? We can just like get at what that big data holds in this really consumable, insightful form.
It's fascinating also just because it feels like, I mean, I don't want to sound like I've got a chip on my shoulder. I probably do, but I don't want to sound like I have a chip on my shoulder. But there's also something about how do I say, this sort of, I guess, the struggle, and I think it reveals itself in many of the journals and many of the kind of writing that happens in dance, which is, this constant struggle with is certainly not suffering from boosterism, put it that way, where you're trying to go, what is it that's being described here, and why are we using this particular form in order to try and describe or articulate this thing which has happened in another time, in another space, in a very different corporeal climate or corporeal environment. And yeah, so it's really there's something about, you were talking about it in the past tense as well, that it's no longer the case regarding data visualization, but there's something about the kind of sexiness of that in that time, I imagine. But
yeah, and it might still be, I'm just not as deeply, I mean, I think I've noticed journalism and other media have not, I mean, there was a huge investment in like visualization teams on like the New York Times, and they still have very savvy visualizations, but I think, and it might have been like crisis of journalism kind of response too, like how can we remain relevant and keep our industry alive. But yeah, I don't know, certainly it's still out there. I just don't know, haven't paid as much attention of like the sort of confidence in the form that you were, or hope in the form that you were seeing like a decade ago.
Which, of course, this is where, and I was basically, this is the whim I was asking you to, invited you here today, really was basically to talk about something that you're less interested in now as an academic. So nice timing, Simon, terrible timing for a dancer.
I'm still interested, definitely. I mean, I think maybe the amateur part of me, another thing I think about a lot is dilettantism. I like to be a bit of a dilettante and explore things and not feel like I have to, I mean, dance is the exception. It's the thing I've done for 40 years, but I tend to be like, oh, I'm gonna move on to something else.
That's the shamateur part, isn't it?
Yeah.
One last thing. You really, you talked about deviant and defiant bodies, and I really, it really, I I don't know, I really felt that language very beautifully, and it made me think about outliers and the value of outliers. And, and that is a very, very particular statistical term, and also the non-normative, and touching just on what we've been talking about, the indescribable. And then you also use the term standard and deviation really poetically. These very, very strong statistical, this language of spread, this language of variation. And I guess there's something about this. I guess I'll just say the language and the incredible power and pervasiveness of statistics. And yeah, I'll say statistics, not probability of statistics. Well, that's probably another different conversation, but statistics in our world. And yet there's something also about how is it that we might hold the deviant or the indescribable or the outlier or the non-normative. And I just, perhaps maybe you have some thoughts there.
Yes, I mean, this in studying like the history of science or being in science studies, I mean, this is one of the most fascinating, but also, troubling, upsetting, awful parts of studying medical history, especially, but science studies more generally, is like the establishment and the reinforcement of the idea of the deviant. I mean, certainly in disability studies, certainly in Black studies and women's studies, queer studies, like all of these ways of approaching studying the history and practice of science have been so important in exposing that, how that border gets policed in such violent ways, and mentioning some of them, and like even like who is deemed expendable in an experimental context. So I think, when I use that word, I'm certainly thinking of that reality and the people who have really continued to expose it, and try to rectify it. But then, the way that the deviant gets reappropriated, and the defiant gets reappropriated as something more positive. And I think when I was a baby ballerina or whatever, I had no interest in being deviant or defiant. Like, I definitely wanted to fit the norms. And when I started to audition and realized how rigid, in some senses, how rigid those norms seemed to me, like in terms of a body shape. And also there's the whole financial aspect of that, like the sacrifice that would have been made to like get to the point of, being the best, or best meeting the expectations. I was like, I think, I stepped onto a different path while still dancing. But now, as an adult in, say, especially a ballet context, like, I appreciate those openings to deviance even in that context. So like, again, the teachers I most gravitate towards are the ones who see the range of bodies and possibilities, even within, the steps, the combinations that they're giving, and kind of encourage it while also respecting like certain maybe norms of technique. And I think that's a very hard line to walk in, especially a classical dance context. But those who can, and those who, I think the teachers, choreographers who encourage it, are the ones that to me are sort of like the leading lights, because I do think standard and deviation it's like the vibration between those two things that really interests me in kind of all of my work, I guess. But as a dancer and someone who appreciates dance, but yeah, I guess I've said a lot there. Now my brain is going in a million directions.
It's great.
So
thank you so much, Heather. So I think what we will do is just take a little break. People can stretch their legs, run away and check their email. I'm sure that's what maybe update social media statuses. No, just have a break. Let's just take 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll come back, and we'll welcome questions from people in the Zoom. Thanks all. Thanks, Heather.
Thank
See you in a
you.
couple of minutes. So let's just see if people can ease their way back on front of their screens. You made me, Heather, you just reminded me, and this will be familiar to colleagues and people in dance, that, you know, perhaps as you were talking about the way in which we adopt metaphors for the body, and you know, at different scales, that and perhaps kind of in my world the most famous is Deborah Hay, a choreographer who talks about the body as being billions of cells, and you would ask you to tune into those billions of cells, and the number always changed, right? Like depending on, you know, which kind of year, and so the number was not important, except the incalculable aspect was really important. And so yeah, and you know, there's a pretty long history, as I'm sure you're aware, that of those kinds of appropriation. It's really appropriating um, kind of more scientific ways of thinking about the body, and then bending them and using them in ways that reveal or afford particular experiences or understandings of being a body or being in motion.
Yes, absolutely. And my beloved ballet teacher is Sandra Chin in San Francisco, in the Bay Area. And I'm forgetting who she's taken this up from. She uses her name all the time, but I'm just not at my fingertips. But uses like a lot of fetal references, like what it was like. Maybe people here on the call will know, like who are some of the teachers, theorists, choreographers who think this way, or movement thinkers or whatever, but like thinking of the body as a fetus, and some of like the ways the body comes into movement from even that point of its evolution. And so I'm always a little like almost distracted in those moments when she's like describing this, because it's like kind of like I get in a little like science fiction mode or something. But I think that's another example of sort of, you know, thinking about maybe scientific perspectives, as well as,
Mm,
you know,
mm.
how the body just evolves into being movement, I guess.
Yeah, or developmental things. So welcome back, everyone. I can't see you. I'm just assuming you're around in some way. So is Elizabeth House, are you related to Elizabeth House, Heather? No.
Yeah, I mean, my mom is Elizabeth Hauser, but she didn't tell me she was coming, and I didn't expressly invite her, so who knows?
He's been stalking you on
It could
on
be.
the internet. So welcome, Elizabeth House. I don't know whether you are indeed Heather's mother, but if you are, fantastic. So yeah, so just as Lily's written, you're very welcome to post comments or questions in the chat, and we can ask you to turn on your camera if you like, and unmute yourself if you like, or I'm happy to read out the questions. So let's just yeah, take a little moment for people to do that. Unless, Rosie, if you just put your camera on to ask something, it is your mother.
There you go.
Hi, Mom. I love.
I didn't even look at the participant list. I wouldn't even have known.
You should be very proud, Elizabeth. So yeah, let's just see how people go. Rose, did you want to? Yeah, great.
I can ask something, yes. A very small thing. That was so fantastic. Thank you so much, Heather. So much to think about. One word that struck me was deviant, and especially because you talked about the deviant body for something like an autoimmune or long COVID, and it's such a that's such a sensitive area of illness and disease, isn't it? And I wonder about that word deviant because maybe in England more than America, I think of it as willful. You know, I think if someone is being deviant on purpose, like, and rather than, and so it made me think about will and the body, and I just wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a good point, right? Is like and just you're using willful, I'm thinking of like Sarah Ahmed's work on willfulness, and especially willful women or feminist willfulness, as something that, is often thought of as agency, but is also something that you can be recruited into, right? You're not really seeing yourself as being deviant, but the ways that you are put into that position because of the structures within which you might not fit, or that you might be pushing against just by being. And I think that's where the disorder or the disease examples are important, because it's not necessarily, it's almost never, right, that someone sought out to have, say, MCS or long COVID. But then you get into this point or into this position of being perceived as deviant because you won't accept that either no, you don't have it, or this is how it should be approached, or your symptoms are not as bad as you think they are, or as valid, or they're not a reason for stepping out of maybe responsibilities in a certain way. So I think it can certainly cut both ways. Like you maybe start in an unwilled position, but then become willful, right? And because you've been put into a position as a result of something that you probably didn't choose. Ahmed's work on this has been important for me in thinking of the book project I'm working on about reproduction amid climate change, but like people are deciding or wondering about whether they want to have children, and sort of like a willfulness around one's reproductive status this is taking it in a different way, but like another like domain in which you can be perceived as being like willful, even if it's really not the way that you think of your reproductive status. But so yeah, I've delved into that idea of maybe deviance or willfulness from that perspective. Thank you.
Perhaps that's again, just from people, feel free to add things to the chat, or you can just put your hands up. It reminds me, you're just picking up on something there, which makes me think about, and of course, this was, I'll say quite literally, the reason I first thought, maybe, Heather House would be quite interesting to hear her talk. And that was this the sense of your relationship to, I'll say before, data, but also in particular the climate emergency. And you've just touched on this then, and I guess I was reminded as you were describing this early research you're doing of Timothy Morton's idea of hyper objects, and I was curious about. I'm going to link this into what we've just been talking about, and what, in a sense, what Rosie just asked, which is there's something about the scale in which we as human beings and our other than human colleagues are operating, that the magnitude of that scale. And then there's the difference between these anecdotes and experiences you've described as a young person learning ballet, I wonder if you can start to get a feeling for, or have thoughts about, in this research you're doing at the moment, this extraordinary discrepancy when people are choosing not to have children at the level of the individual, and the scale of this, the ecological, I'll just call it, situation.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of, so I'm approaching this question of how climate change inflects reproductive intentions from a lot of different angles. And I'm especially focusing on the values that arise and come into conflict in that at that intersection of reproduction and climate. And one of the things is definitely like individual and community on a lot of scales. And so, I mean, I think in one set, I mean, the first thing people think, and I think the thing I thought coming into the project was to talk about the decision not to have children in order to improve the climate situation, right? Like to reduce carbon emissions. So that is one approach, right, to the issue. It's, in fact, not many people are making that decision ultimately. But it's one of the reasons it gets dismissed is it seems like a scalar ignorance, right? Like, how can you possibly think that your individual action, even if it's at the scale, like the biggest individual scale potentially of choosing whether to have a child or not, it's not actually at the scale of the global climate or greenhouse gas emissions and all of its impacts. So that's one way that this scalar challenge comes in. But I think it comes up in a lot of other aspects of people's thinking around these questions, like a temporal scale of looking back. So people who think they might have some ancestral responsibility. And I'm thinking especially of people who have faced genocide or who have faced enslavement and all of the death and reproductive limitations that have come around that. Thinking like, no, I owe it to my ancestors or my lineage or my past to continue into the future. And then on the other hand, like thinking way out into the future of, well, okay, I'm thinking about having a child, maybe even just one child, but then I can't account for all of the generations that come after that. So I think like this scalar, it's a very, I mean, I'm not saying everyone thinks about this when they're making reproductive decisions or have intentions, but that is sort of, it is, you're at the sort of the nexus of all of these scales, and they're spatial, they're temporal, they're embodied, right? They're all of these things, and it's quite complex and messy, right? So obviously climate change is, and Morton's terms, a hyper object and invokes all of these things as well. And then I think when you bring in the question of fertility, questions of family that bring on its own like scalar complexity, it just sort of amplifies it all and raises all of these values and tensions.
Yeah, thank you. I sort of curiously quiet people in our audience today, which is making me equally curious. So, anyone? So they're challenging my hosting capabilities, I think. Let's put them on the spot. They agreed beforehand. Let's not say a thing and see him stew.
It's the
What about
teaching
you?
strategy, right? You have to, pause, take a sip of coffee, count to
Exactly,
10.
exactly. I'm going to do that right now. And so I wonder how long I was thinking then, how long can I just stay quiet and just see what happens?
It's hard as a host, but I understand.
It's totally fine, of course. So I'll keep going. But I don't think we need to also worry. Like if people haven't got questions, then we can just we can wrap up as well. So I'll ask a couple more things, and then unless anyone at that point, if no one has got anything to contribute, then we can just stop. I think you talked about this epistemology of becoming, of process. I mean, first of all, I'm curious about my sense of the growing use of the word epistemology. I'm listening to podcasts quite a lot where it comes up, an epistemological thing. And my uncle once joked, my uncle who's a physician once joked he could never remember the difference between ontology and epistemology. Like they were always this thing where you had to stop and, think about these things. But it's interesting you used this, and then you also adopted you described an attitude of experimentation. And I was thinking about this kind of co-opting, not that you were co-opting it, but we certainly in dance have, I think, co-opted a lot of that language. We talk about laboratories. We talk about experimenting. We talk about experimental dance. That's not a new thing. And there's something where it made me think as you were describing this, as I say, or as you described epistemology of becoming, that there was something about an attitude of inquiry under conditions in which there is no end, or there is no objective, that there is no end to meet or to gain. And there's something, and of course you were threading that with amateurism, so it just doesn't seem quite the right word, and I'm curious to hear a little bit more about inquiry, an attitude of inquiry, experimentation, and also your use of the word epistemology in this particular context.
Yeah, I do. One of the things that has interested me as the amateur dancer who returns is, I am sometimes like, what am I getting out of this? Like, where am I going with this? I mean, there's an easy answer. I have to move. Like I've known my whole life, I think, but it's even clearer to me now, I think, especially having, work demands and it being intellectual work, like I have to carve out that space. So that's an easy answer. But sort of like one of the things I've come to is that inquiry that doesn't have a particular goal. Like I'm very curious when I'm in a dance class now, even as I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm curious about like as I mentioned in those remarks, like the difference from say 20 years ago. I mean, when you have that many years, actually 40, though I don't quite know how I felt at 4 years old, but like I'm just very curious as I'm doing the movement, which I think I felt when I was younger, but I was much more attentive to like executing things in a certain way that wouldn't allow for the kind of inquiry that I have now as I'm dancing. Like when your goal is to do like 4 pirouettes or do fouettes or do whatever, it's very different from being like, what is happening here, right? I'm like, why when I stepped, well, I'm often doing ballet at home, so I don't even have a bar, but let's just say, like, why when I stepped at the bar, did basically nothing settle into its right place, or like the place I felt comfortable until this part of the class, like how did I get from, 10 o'clock to 10:15 and what unfolded in there? And it's not an inquiry toward an end by any means. It's just this sort of curiosity, often based in difference and change, that I didn't, and who's to say what other people experienced in their dance training, but that I did not experience as I had a more end-focused, goal-focused relationship to it. And where experimentation is kind of toward a goal, like I certainly would like to do turns with more facility, but it's also experimentation in that vein of curiosity and also deep, like I started doing yoga in my 30s when I couldn't dance. I lived somewhere where there was like just no adult really dance classes, and we didn't have this Zoom environment back then. So I picked up yoga and got into it over the years, and how like that also informs what I do in a way that's very different. Like I was reading Evans, I think it was in Evans's essay, talking about like dance, especially ballet, I think, right, is so informed by this idea of like being in flight, being weightless, being off the ground. And of course, like other dance forms like modern, you know, that shook all that up, right? Martha Graham, like all these people who helped us think about the ground, the importance of the ground. But for me, that really struck me in like doing yoga and like the relationship between like ground and elevation that I didn't have in my training as a younger dancer. So yeah, all these forms of inquiry to me, I use the term epistemology partly because it's the terms in which I've done a lot of my work on information. Also because it was one of the terms we used in our like email conversation. So I wanted to like acknowledge that I had been listening to you. But also I do think it is a way of knowing in dance. That's like that, the inquisitive, curious mode of knowing that to me is different from a more goal-oriented way of knowing, perhaps. And they're not unrelated, but because all of the things, you know, that we learn maybe towards a goal will inform the inquiry, but they do just feel quite different in practice.
I really liked, thank you. I really liked that that sort of the way you described standing at the bar and this sort of settling of the body, and you asked the question, how did I get here? And there's something really I think there's something which kind of captures that sort of spirit of inquiry in that, or even as we maybe become more expert, this sort of distinction between change in perception and the perception of change, and so, you know, these quite distinct things that are going on as we're settling more, as we're able to settle more clearly into our bodies. I think, Heather, I think that's a good place for us to stop. So just on behalf of the team here at CEDA, I really want to thank you for your time. All the best for the rest of your fellowship, if that's the right word. And certainly greetings from here in the United Kingdom. To everyone else, thank you for coming. Thank you for being here and for your thinking and your presence or absence, if you know what I mean, in terms of being behind screens. We'll take a little break, I think, from CEDA Invites, and probably until the autumn. Not sure about that yet, so stay tuned. But thanks all, and Heather, but particularly thanks to Lily. Thanks also, as ever, for your work making this happen.
Thank you very much, Simon. I enjoyed this.
See you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.